ალბათ უკვე ინფორმირებული ხართ, რომ მორიგი თავდასხმა დაიწყო ილიას უნივერსიტეტზე, მაგრამ აი ესეთ საბჭოთა სტილის ალბათ ყველაზე მეტად რომ გავიხსენოთ და აღვიდგინოთ როგორი ქვეყნიდან მოვდივართ, ალბათ ამ ატმოსფეროს გვიქმნის დღევანდელი ჩვენი მთავრობა, რომ ალბათ პიროვნულად განვიცადოთ რა იყო 1930-იანი წლები თუ შემდგომი პერიოდი, ამით დავამთავრებ და გადავალ დღევანდელ ჩვენ შეხვედრაზე. ძალიან მიხარია რომ მეკო პატივი ეს შეხვედრა და საუბარი გავხსნა ილიას სახელმწიფო უნივერსიტეტის სოციალური და კულტურის კვლევების ინსტიტუტის სახელით, რომელიც მასპინძლობს დღევანდელ ღონისძიებას. ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი მართლა ისტორიული მნიშვნელობის ორი მონოგრაფია არის გამოცული და თარგმნილი ქალბატონ ნატოს დამსახურებით ქართულ ენაზე. ერთი, რომელიც ეხება საკმაოდ მნიშვნელოვან ჩახლართულ და რთულ თემას, ჩვენივე უნივერსიტეტის პროფესორის ბატონ ტიმოთი ბლაუელდის მონოგრაფია ნესტორ ლაკობაზე, უმნიშვნელოვანეს ფიგურაზე 20-იანი 30-იანი წლების მის საქართველოს ისტორიის და საბჭოთა კავშირის ისტორიის და მეორე ქალბატონ კლერკ კაიზერის ძალიან აქტუალური და მნიშვნელოვანი მონოგრაფია, რომელიც უკვე ეხება განსაკუთრებით პოსტსტალინურ ეპოქას, სტალინურ და პოსტსტალინურ ეპოქას, ეროვნებათა პოლიტიკას, აი უკვე სათაურშივე ვხედავთ ქართველი და საბჭოელი და ტიტულოვანი ნაციის თემას. ეს არის უაღრესად მნიშვნელოვანი და აქტუალური თემა, არა მხოლოდ საბჭოთა წარსულის გაგებისთვის, არამედ დღევანდელობის, თანამედროვეობის და იმ პროცესების, რომელიც სწორედ საბჭოთა ეპოქიდან მომდინარეობს. გამომდინარე დღევანდელი ფორიაქისგან, ალბათ აისახება კიდევ ჩვენს აუდიტორიის სიმრავლეზე, მაგრამ ეს რეალურად არაფერს არ ნიშნავს, თუ გავითვალისწინებთ, რომ ჩანაწერი იქნება და ყოველთვის ჩანაწერი ვიდეოების ყურება უკვე დამკვიდრებული არის ჩვენთან მას ბევრად დიდი აუდიტორია ყავს და რასაც დღეს მოვისმენთ, მისი მოსმენის და ნახვის საშუალება ასეულობით ადამიანს მიეცემა. მეც აღარ გავაგრძელებ, კიდევ ერთხელ დიდი მადლობა ამ პუბლიკაციებისთვის და დღევანდელი შეხვედრისთვის და უკვე შეგვიძლია დავიწყოთ მსჯელობა. დიახ, ქალბატონ ნატოს ვთხოვ, გამომცემლობა ზიარი, ეგეც უნდა ხაზი გაესვას.
დიდი მადლობა, ყველას დიდი მადლობა. თქვენს დიდი მადლობა, კლერ და ტიმოთის ამ შვენიერი წიგნებისთვის პირველ რიგში და მე მინდა ვთქვა, რომ კლერი ჩამოსულია ლიტერატურის ფესტივალზე, რომელიც იხსნება დღეს საღამოს, სხვათა შორის. და ჩვენ დრო ვიხელთეთ რაღაცნაირად, იმიტომ რომ ეს ორი წიგნი ეხმიანება ერთმანეთს პრინციპში და ვიფიქრეთ, რომ საინტერესო იქნება ეს დისკუსია და მე ძალიან დიდი მადლობა მინდა ვთქვა ასევე ქეთი ეფაძეს, რომელიც არის ამ დისკუსიის მოდერატორი და არის მკვლევარი სწორედ ეროვნული იდენტობის საკითხების. შარშან დაიცავით ხო დისერტაცია ამ თემაზე, ხო? და ძალიან მიხარია მეც, როგორც გამომცემელსაც, რომ ასეთი მკვლევარები მოდიან ქართველი და ჩვენც გამომცემლებს გვექნება საშუალება, რომ არა მარტო ვთქვათ, უცხოელი მკვლევარების წიგნები გამოვცეთ, არამედ საბოლოოდ ქართველი მკვლევარებისაც, რაც ძალიან კარგი იქნება. დიდი მადლობა და აღარ გავაგრძელებთ ქეთის მივცემთ სიტყვას როგორც მოდერატორს.
Gamardoba. Hello, I'm Iliaus from Tbilisi State University's Cultural Studies Institute. It's an honor to be here to facilitate today's discussion. Tbilisi-Soხუმი-Მოსკოვი, the Soviet Triangle. And this event is based on the discussion of two important books on the recent history of Georgia, Georgian and Soviet, entitled Nationhood and the Spectre of Stalin in the Caucasus, and Clientelism and Nationality in an Early Soviet Fiefdom. Before I say a couple of words about these books, I would like to introduce the authors. Probably some of you know. Professor Blauelt, who teaches at Ilia State University, is a professor of Soviet and post-Soviet studies, and He also serves as a regional director for the South Caucasus at American Councils for International Education. Anna has authored numerous articles on Russian and Soviet history, and he focuses on Soviet Georgia and Abkhazia. His works are published by reputable journals, and he currently resides in Tbilisi. And Claire Kaiser is a professor at Georgetown University Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. She has contributed to edited volumes on nationalism and Soviet studies, and she has experience of living and working in Georgia. And I'm happy because probably I'm sure that she has insights into modern Georgian society and culture. Now let me say a few words about these books. You can see them here. Both of them explore the development of Soviet nationality policy in Georgia through the framework of patron-client relationships, and they illustrate how this personal connection affects the allocation of resources, distribution of material rewards and status among different ethnic groups. In return for loyalty to the Soviet center, trusted cadres were granted some authority to manage local affairs and promote their interests at republican and autonomous levels. This patron-client network rested on two main principles of the Soviet Union, which led the foundation of the system. The first principle was ethno-federal division of territories, which means that territories of different sizes were organized around titular nationalities. And the second principle was described ethnicity, which Professor Kaiser calls entitled in her work. So it means that ethnicity was formally assigned to both individuals and territories, and it shaped interactions between ethnic regions, their leaders, and the central authorities. These books follow a similar narrative focus, namely how informal networks shaped the power dynamics within the Soviet system, balancing the revolutionary ambitions of the Soviet leadership with the national aspirations of local elites. However, they have different emphasis. Kaiser's work is on Georgian nation building process after World War II, and mainly how Stalinist cult became entangled with Georgian nationalism, and how the processes of destalization affected its formation. While Professor Blauvelt centers his analysis on Soviet Abkhazia, which played a significant role in Soviet policy under Néstor Lakoba's leadership, and he also explores how the shifts in Soviet modernization policies affected power dynamics in Abkhazia. So these topics addressed in these books are very important for recent history of Georgia, and I believe that their critical examination is important not only for academic purposes, but for more practical purposes, for reevaluating or revisiting the collective memory of Georgians, because we know that this triangle, the Soviet triangle, Sokhumi, Tbilisi, and Moscow, exists today, and it's become subject of to political manipulation both in Sokhumi and Tbilisi, and there are many contentious issues between Georgians and Abkhaz that are hotly debated in these groups, and which also strengthens Russia's position in the region. And also help transplantation of the old Soviet model into contemporary politics. We all know that past experiences cannot entirely explain the present dynamics in this region, or cannot explain entirely the politics, but they must be acknowledged, understood, and addressed. And I believe that we as a nation have this potential. I would like to open discussion with the first question, which is about Soviet nationality policy and its implementation in Soviet Georgia, and in Professor Blauvelt's words, how Soviet power was established, institutionalized, internalized in Abkhazia. And I'm interested in gaining a comprehensive understanding about 1920s, 1930s Abkhazia. How did Soviet nationality policy influence the formal and informal network formation in Georgian and Abkhaz societies, and how did it affect communication between these groups? what were the expectations of the Soviet leaders when launching this policy, and how this policy was viewed by the local elites? This is my initial questions to both authors, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
So I should probably start, since my book focuses more on the early Soviet period, and early Soviet experience is centered both on two different issues, and one of those obviously is the nationality question, and obviously that's one that we'll have to talk about a lot today. And the Soviet regime took very specific decisions on nationality, and ones that were contradictory to their ideological positions when they came to power. Bolsheviks, as Marxists, obviously don't like the idea of nation as a defining category. Their assumption is that in the long term, it's something that relates to the bourgeois capitalist state of socio-economic relations, and therefore should disappear. And of course, during their experience of coming to power and in the Civil War, they were forced to confront the power of nationalism, the reality of it, and to accommodate it and even co-opt that. And so they took very specific decisions. The 10th Party Congress in 1921 and the 12th Party Congress in 1923 of how they were going to deal with nationalism. And they understood that it was a powerful force. They still assumed that at some point in the future it would disappear. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when thinking about the Bolshevik approaches to nationality, that they always assumed in the long term that it was something that would disappear. The question was how to get to that point and how to depoliticize nationalism, how to remove it as a threat to us politically. And so their decision was that we should accommodate nationalism. We should give to the different nationalities those things that nationalists would otherwise aspire to, things that they considered elements of form. And they were very specific about this, right? And there's the famous quotation of Stalin, that Soviet power, he was actually talking about Soviet literature, but I think it can be applied more generally, that he said, Soviet literature is socialist in content, national in form. And by content, of course, he meant really power. That was, the party was not going to be divided up, power would be concentrated in the center. But form is something else, and we can give to the different nationalities these things which are not specifically political in their view. So things like languages, literatures, costumes, dances, cuisine, all of folklore, all of these things could be given to the nationalities, and therefore they wouldn't need to fight for them. And we can create a kind of equality among nations, and in the future that will mean that national animosity will disappear, and sometime in the future we will have zbliżenie i slanie i drużba narodów, right? And everybody will be happy, and these things will disappear. And of course, this has several different aspects to it. One of those is the encouragement of, again, local form, and things like publishing, school curriculum, dance ensembles, creating theaters, and all of that. The other aspect of it, of course, is about personnel, cadres. And one of the crucial aspects of the early Soviet period, of early Soviet rule, is that there's not a lot of Bolsheviks. It's quite a small party. It expands dramatically during the Civil War, but it's still maybe several 100,000 people in a country of more than 100 million. So how do you govern? And a huge expanse of territory, and especially in the periphery. How do you govern this massive territory with a relatively small number of people? So throughout the early Soviet period, they have this problem of cadres, of personnel. How are we going to govern this? Who are we going to bring in? Who are you going to recruit? We need to recruit people who are functional, who are reliable, who are at least passively intelligent and literate. And these two things overlap in the periphery and in places like the Caucasus. It becomes a criteria of selection. Who are you going to choose? Well, nationality policy is telling us that we should give privileges based on national identity. That's part of our project. We're recognizing these national territories. And of course, the other sort of central aspect of these decisions of Soviet nationality policy is that we are going to recognize national identity. There were some who argued we should get rid of it. There's some who argued we should disaggregate ethnic identity from territory. And ultimately, they took a decision that we are going to recognize and assign, classify, officially recognize individual nationality to the person, and also nationality to particular territories. and I'm sure Claire will speak more about that. But the key thing here of this question of personnel is in these peripheries, in where we are defining territories based on national identity, we need to recruit cadres who represent those nationalities. And that was a big problem in some places, and particularly in those areas which the Bolsheviks would, without any hesitation or political correctness, would define as отсталые, as backwards. They defined peoples as продвинутые and отсталые. There was no political correctness in Bolshevik terminology. And in those places which they considered отсталые, which were backwards, more Asiatic, they low levels of literacy, of education, who do you get? And there were a very small number of people you could possibly choose from, and yet they needed to represent. They needed to choose cadres from those ethnicities. So those two things, the shortage of cadres, the need to recruit people, and often through personal connections. Like who do you recruit? And most usually throughout the Soviet Union, it was based on personal connections, people they knew from the Civil War, from the Revolutionary Underground, from the Red Army. And you would use those personal connections in order to recruit. So that overlies with the nationality policy in the sense that you need to recruit in these territories people who are passively representative of that ethnicity. What I've argued in my book is that it creates, maybe counterintuitively or certainly counter to what the Bolsheviks might have expected, a kind of situation of dependency of the center, because they need to choose somebody who's going to do the job for them. And once they've made the decision of, I'm going to recruit these guys, and people from this family, people from this village, people from this clan, whatever it should be, who represent that nation, then you're sort of stuck with them. And your success depends on the success of those people. And I think that's one of the things that I think the Abkhazia situation and the group, the network around Nestor Lakoba comes to represent. The Bolsheviks, both in Tiflis and in Moscow, have made their bet on this group. And there were other possibilities, right? There were other groupings, there were other potential local Abkhaz elites that they could have recruited, but they went with this particular group. And once they had made that choice, then they somehow, in some ways, became captive to that group. Their success depended on the success of the local group. And that gives a kind of power to that local group, because they can make demands on the center. More generally speaking, in the early Soviet period, and nationality policy, as Keti implies, does go through changes in the Stalin period. And Claire, I think, makes use of the term ethnophilia for the 1920s period, where they were really trying to emphasize all these different nationalities. I think there were 126 or something nationalities in the 1926 census, like every possible nationality, and giving them privileges, recognizing their form, and recruiting them, giving them positive discrimination opportunities, recruiting them into the system. The Caucasus, in part perhaps because of the strength of networks, becomes a place where a very powerful informal network forms around the leadership of the Caucasus, particularly around Sergo Ordzhonikidze and his so-called Kavkazский Khvost, right, his Caucasian group. And it becomes, it's a grouping that's sort of based in Tiflis because the institutions are based in Tiflis, but it is more a broad Caucasian sort of coalition where he has Armenians and Azerbaijanis and other people who are part of Abkhaz, who are part of this network. And it forms part of the support base for Stalin. So it's one of the advantages that Stalin has in the center, in his competition for power, this Caucasian network, which becomes really very powerful. By the end of the 1930s, you have within that network the emergence of the secret police group from Lavrenti Beria and his particular network, which begins as a sort of subgroup within this Ordzhonikidze network. Lakoba's group in Abkhazia is another one of those groupings, a more regionally based group in Abkhazia. And throughout most of the 1920s, these more general Ordzhonikidze Caucasian network is in cooperation with Lakoba and his group. Lakoba is part of that group, as is Beria. In the 1930s, things begin to change, right? Ordzhonikidze in 1926 goes to Moscow. He rises up in the power hierarchy. He becomes head of the general inspectorate of the party. Then he becomes minister for light industry and so forth. He's rising up. Lakoba is continuing to develop his network within Abkhazia, but in Tiflis, gradually Beria is consolidating his control over that network, bringing in his people from the secret police, is really something quite rare. I don't know if there are any other examples in the Soviet system of a network that really comes out of the secret police and gradually takes over, displaces the existing party network, and consolidates around itself. With the revolution from above, industrialization, especially collectivization, things begin to change. The kinds of local rents that networks can extract in the early Soviet system is much broader, and that begins to contract with the centralization of the Stalin's revolution from above. And then, about 1933, 1934, we have the Great Turn, as they call it, Veliki Pervarot in nationality policy, where there's kind of a switch in emphasis away from this ethnophilia of the 1920s to concentration on larger nations, particularly ones that have union republics as opposed to the smaller kinds of territories. And that coincides with, again, the rise of Beria. Beria, I think, makes direct use of his connections with Lakoba in order to rise in the Caucasian network, in order to get the attention of Stalin, to raise his own portfolio. But then after this turn, it also, I think, coincides with the turn in how the center viewed informal networks more generally, that by the mid-1930s, and as a result of the revolution from above, this centralization that's part of the first 5-year plans, there's a shift from locally based patronage networks to more central ones and larger groupings of networks. And so Lakoba's network in Abkhazia is exactly the kind of local network that the center turns against. And in a speech, a very famous speech in 1937, Stalin directly criticizes these local, he calls them группировки, семейства, that he thinks are undermining things, and he wants to get rid of them. So that coincides with the rise of Beria, who is able to make use of that, and gradually by the end of the 1930s, well, really 1936, gets rid of Lakoba and then displaces the Lakoba network. So a long answer to a short question.
So I can try to pick up where Tim left off there, and I would just maybe add two kind of big picture thoughts to his excellent overview of the landscape of early Soviet nationality policy, not just intent but also practice. The first is really that this policy or policies over time, didn't stop in the 30s. I think certainly in the historiography of this topic, there's overwhelming focus on the 20s and 30s, and then historically it's kind of then jumped to like 1985. My book, one of the sort of key questions I look at is what happens in between and why, because obviously it was not static. There was an enormous amount of change that happened, not just in what policies from the center may have sought, but how those were interpreted and disseminated over time by local officials, by populations, and that sort of thing. And so, just want to underscore that this really is a story of long-term change over time. It's not kind of one where the seeds were sown in the 20s and 30s, time stops and then you jump ahead to the 80s. On the one hand, that seems obvious. On the other hand, we're like just now starting to tell that story among historians. So I thought it would be worth mentioning here. The other piece that I wanted to maybe do at the outset is to sort of expand upon this concept that I introduce in my book to try to explain what this really bizarre mechanism that the Soviets put into place to manage the problem of nationality was. And it's this term that I use is entitled nationhood, which translated into Georgian I acknowledge is a bit clunky. So I thought, it's maybe a bit more straightforward in English, but I thought I would explain a little bit why I decided to try to come up with a more descriptive term for what this was all about and what it meant to the affected populations. So I use the term entitled nationhood not in a pejorative sense. It's really to try to find an alternative to the term titular and titularity to describe Georgians in Georgia, Azerbaijanis in Azerbaijan, Armenians in Armenia, etc. So I'm not limiting the use of this term to Georgia. It really is something meant to be able to be kind of a framework for all of the Soviet Union. And so it looks at kind of what the legally inscribed rights and privileges were for these national groups in their respective territories. So what access an individual would have, if they were a Georgian in Georgia or a Ukrainian in Ukraine, etc. Due to their passport nationality, due to the desire to increase the nomenclatura and cadre representation in that nationality, etc. And so, kind of what these groups were entitled to by the sort of structure of Soviet nationality policy, but that's sort of not the end. That's only half of the story. Much of what my book is looking at is what individuals did with that entitlement, the extent to which they tried to act upon those rights and privileges that were inscribed in law, and the extent to which they were able to make claims on those rights over time. It was not consistent. It was something that I think, in the period examined in my book, which is principally the 40s through the 80s, people are testing the bounds of what these entitlements meant, how they could access them, and what that meant for non-entitled populations in the Republic. And so that's what I'm kind of trying to do with this term. But I think, the Abkhaz case is where the tension between the structure of entitlements really, I think, is most glaring. In my book, I did not set out early in my research projects to kind of have Abkhazia and the Abkhaz case as a case study sort of running through the book. It was something that I very much came to through the archives, and in particular, just over and over again encountering this triangle to which the title of this talk is devoted. Just seeing, on the one hand, kind of what Abkhaz and Abkhazia are, entitled to on paper, despite the fact that they're a stark minority in terms of population in the Republic, despite the fact that the relationship between Sokhumi and Tbilisi is so contested over time, and despite the fact that it seemed like it was something that the center really wasn't exactly sure how to grapple with, given how challenging that relationship was. I think it reveals, on the one hand, both the possibilities and the limits of the system of entitlements that the Abkhaz case was really willing to test in a lot of different ways, kind of over the duration of the Soviet period. I think the other thing that I would perhaps introduce that I suspect will invite some more discussion too, getting into later decades, but something that we see somewhat as the inverse of this concept of entitled nationhood, which I see as very, very activist. It is a way of engaging with these policies and structures and institutions in a way to claim, what is yours or what is your people's. But the sort of inverse of that we see Georgians, Abkhaz, other populations residing in Abkhazia or even in Georgia more broadly, adopting kind of different positions of minorityhood depending on who the audience is. So, whether they're appealing to authorities in Tbilisi or Moscow or elsewhere in the Union, who is the perpetrator and who is the victim, it really depends on where you sit and who you're kind of appealing to. So that's another kind of change over time trajectory that I think I try to talk about quite a bit in the book, but I think is also quite applicable to this conversation. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you for your accurate answers to my questions, and I switched to the period of Stalinization, and I agree with you, Claire, that enormous work are done on the period of 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s is somehow omitted even from our historiography. We can explain in case of Georgia because there are some reforms were carried out in Abkhazia that Georgians don't love to speak, don't enjoy it, and somehow the historians keep this moment from history, and we also have the same chronological line that 1930s ends, and then the history continues from 1950s. So you already mentioned that 1930s situation in Abkhazia across the Soviet Union underwent significant changes. The Stalinist shift that is often called Stalinism impacted many aspects of party policy. And in case of Georgia, this is a period when two rival groups emerged in Abkhazia, Lakobas clan and Beryas clan, which Professor Blauvelt already highlighted. And both of them use their connection to gain dominance over Abkhazia and undermine each other's power on this territory. So this struggle ends in 1936 when Lakoba was founded in his hotel room in Tbilisi, and then Beryevshchina, that is Abkhaz called this period, starts in Abkhazia. And this period is also accompanied by painful reforms and by the Stalinist terror, which eradicated sometimes real, sometimes imagined opponents of the Soviet system. And then we have 1940s when Abkhaz developed resentment towards Georgians because of these reforms, administrative, economic and other reforms. And this is a period when new narrative is born in Abkhazia, claiming that Stalin is Georgian nationalist and who tries to defend the Georgian national project and discriminate Abkhaz. But they voice this narrative only in the period of de-Stalinization, which also laid the foundation of the idea of Abkhazia separation from Georgia. They use the period of de-Stalinization and Khrushchev's speech to regain the privileges, national privileges in Abkhazia that they enjoyed in the period of Korenizatsiya. But on the contrary, de-Stalinization is a painful chapter for Georgians, for Georgia's history, because peaceful demonstration was crushed in Tbilisi on March 9, which this memory, Georgians kept this memory in private spaces. It only voiced after April 9, 1989. But in this period, Georgians also had grievances towards Khrushchev's government. And they somehow lost the privileges they enjoyed during the Stalin's period. And my next question is about this de-Stalinization period. I would like to ask you why Stalin's cult became entangled with Georgian nationalism in the perception of both Georgians and Abkhaz, and how did the Abkhaz and Georgian images shaped the development, their communication and identities in the later periods. Thank you.
So I think 1956 was really a watershed moment for many reasons. It also, I think, was the entry point into my book. Why I started asking these questions to begin with was just trying to better understand the March events really as a point of transition, because just the de-Stalinization question, there's so much to untangle there, and one that I think continues to have a lot of resonance, I think, in Georgian public discourse. So I think, to your first question, why Stalin's cult became entangled with Georgian nationalism.
Is a perception of Georgia as a place?
Yeah. So I think, clearly the Stalin cult was something carefully constructed from above, from Moscow. And that, on the one hand was pretty consistent throughout the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, the socialist world once there was more to it than just the Soviet Union. At the same time, because Stalin only had one homeland, there was little, I think, despite the extremely pervasive aspects and violent toolkit of the Bolshevik, regime, there was little they could do to sort of control the more peculiar, almost grassroots ways in which a national cult of Stalin developed among Georgians. And so it was not something that became readily apparent in the 30s, even during the 40s, but with Khrushchev's policy shift, which came as a shock to everyone, not just here, across the board. That is where this conflict between the top-down Stalin cult and how Stalin was perceived nationally in Georgia, not just by Georgians, really, I think, came into open conflict. I mean, people died on March 9th, kind of as a result of that. So I think what this meant in the case of Georgians in Georgia was that the top-down process of de-Stalinization kind of did not occur here over the subsequent years in the way that it did in the rest of the Union and sort of Warsaw Pact countries. It meant that what was already, I think, a highly localized veneration of Stalin as a national hero became even more challenging to sort of redefine and rein in subsequent decades, because it was localized, it was individual, it wasn't rigidly controlled for the top, which makes it then harder to sort of rein in and redefine. Something that I look at in the book is the immediate aftermath of the March events in 1956 and the attempt, I guess, from like a propaganda and almost public relations perspective to put the genie back in the bottle and re-educate people through party discussions and that sort of thing as to why the cult of Stalin is terrible and why Khrushchev is doing what he's doing, etc. Of course, it was much too little too late in terms of getting people there's no way to understand how dozens of people could get killed for a demonstration like that. But in trying to just manage the aftermath among party members at a minimum. But if you look at the way that Mujahideen, who was first secretary at the time, how his sort of explanation changed both locally as well as with his bosses in Moscow, and the ways in which individuals in Georgia were kind of understanding events at the time. You see, at the end of the day, a sort of shift in a lot of the blame for the kind of permission of nationalist excesses in Georgia, air quotes here, bubbling up, to really be laid at Beria's feet. He was almost a scapegoat, such that Stalin then ends up being saved a little bit. That's a little bit crude of an explanation, but at least publicly and from an official perspective, it seems that Beria was given much more of the blame for a lot of the shortcomings that Khrushchev had attributed to Stalin. We see something very different in Abkhazia, where I think if you look at party meetings, at explanations, at public discourse coming in 1956, 1957, there they really view Beria and Stalin as one and the same. They don't distinguish between them in terms of policy. And so I think that at the time was a bit different in terms of the sort of two different populations. And it's something that only became more challenging, I think, over time as de-Stalinization preceded, if unevenly and inconsistently, and then becomes, I think, more relevant when we get into the 70s and 80s as well. So I'll stop there in case Tim has further things to add.
I would only add that one of the perhaps inevitable consequences of these early Soviet decisions about nationality policy, again, the idea of tying ethnicity to individuals, to territory, and making decisions about who gets what based on national identity, in a situation where you have territorial entities which are of vastly different size, amount of resources, population, and so forth, is that, of course, it doesn't create equality, it creates a hierarchy, and an unequal hierarchy. And those who argue that the Soviet Union was an empire would point to this fact, that you definitely had a central ethnicity, the Russians, who really dominated the state, and then you had other ethnicities that had varying levels of privilege, but still were always, it was a hierarchy. And in that hierarchical situation, when they had also decided to try to depoliticize nationalism or contain nationalism by, again, giving things that they considered to be foreign to the different nations, it has the inevitable result of creating a hierarchy in which these things that are considered non-political form actually become political indicators of standing within that hierarchy. And one of those things, obviously, is the place of Stalin in the Soviet system. I think there's a kind of inevitability in a hierarchical situation where different nationalities are competing for position within that hierarchy. That the fact that the Tsar of all the Russias is your guy, that he comes from your republic. And this is a competition not just about something abstract. It's really determines where you stand in that system, how much you get, how much opportunity you get, what kind of investment you get. So it has real consequences to it. So I think there's a kind of inevitability given the fact, the role of Stalin in the cult of Stalin in being the generalissimus, being perhaps the most powerful single individual on the planet for several decades. that really means something. So there develops this overlap between Georgian national identity and Stalinism, what I might have called Georgian national Stalinism or Stalinist national Georgian nationalism. So that it's obviously there, and it is, I think, one of the key factors behind the events in 1956, and one of the kind of paradoxes of modern Georgian history, that you have, as a result of the actions of the state of cracking down in 1956, a radicalization, but the emergence of Georgian national movement, which comes directly out of that, where you have all these young people who are protesting at first in favor of Stalin, people like Zviad Gamsavurdian, Kastava, and a lot of other people, who then sort of become radicalized with their teenagers then, and then they become the basis of the national movement, especially the dissident national movement, as it emerges over the succeeding decades. And the other thing I think that happens as a direct result from de-Stalinization and from around this period is a transformation of these kinds of narratives about national standing to the context of the official intelligentsia discourses. And this happens after 1956 with the sort of the otipel, the thaw, where it becomes more possible to have discussions about things within limits, of course. But one of the paradoxes, the other paradoxes of Soviet history and nationalities is in the 1950s, 60s, and through the end of the Soviet experience, you have emerging within the official institutions of the Soviet state and the Communist Party, all of these institutes of history, of anthropology, of literature, of all the unions of different academic specialties, the emergence of narratives which are in some ways a return to nation-building discourses of the 19th century, and particularly the fascination with the concept of ethnogenes, with mining anthropology and mining archaeology and medieval and ancient history to try to define nation. And one of the aspects which it plays out here, of course, is the so-called history wars of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the competing theories about ethnogenes, about the Ingarokva theory of where the Abkhaz came from, the responses of the Abkhaz. And of course, this is not unique to here. You had the same kinds of historical academic conflicts, over who owns Karabakh, the Albanian theory of what those churches were, what those literacies were, and who ultimately it comes down to this question, which I think is another inevitable result of these early Soviet decisions about ethno-territoriality and ethnic identity, that it creates a zero-sum conception of identity both for the individual and for territories. And that is, everybody can, in the end of the day, have one ethnicity, right? You can't be really mixed. You have to choose what is in your passport. You have to make a decision at some point. And there was some flexibility. People could game the system, could in some cases change their nationality or do something, make their nationality into something more advantageous. But that was strictly kind of limited what you could do. And with regard to territory, ultimately this idea of either titularity or entitlement, it also means that territory can only belong to one nation at the end of the day. It's ours or it's not. And there were some cases where territories were stuck together, like Chechen and Goshetia and Kabardino-Balkaria, but in both cases, there was an actual territory that was Chechen, there was an actual territory that was Ingush. There are some exceptions. Dagestan was always a little too crazy to fit into that system. You had the attempt to create the Birdo-Birstan, what it was called, the Jewish Republic. But generally speaking, there was a conception of one nation, one language, one territory. And at the end of the day, it's ours or it's theirs. And so much of this focus on ethnogenes, on these narratives of identity of history was about saying that this territory is ours, right? So in the Azerbaijani-Armenian discourses, it was to say, Karabakh, at the end of the day, the people who lived there historically were us, were ours, therefore the territory is ours and not theirs. And because of this zero-sum conception of territoriality combined with identity, it means it has to be one or the other. You can't be shared.
Is there anything you would like to add?
Well, I think you referenced the Ingarokwa sort of debate, but the fact that really bursts into the open just prior to the 1956 crackdown, but then I think intensifies just after. I mean, I think the book came out in 1954. The kind of initial controversial review of it came out in Zaryavostok, I think in 1955, but then, the real public debate, demonstration, etc., around this Georgi Merchule, and in particular the sort of Abkhazia origin theories, that's bringing Abkhaz to the streets in 1957. And so that is what they're using the opening provided by the thaw and these sort of official modes of discourse to do, is to wage a historiographical debate, including among academic journals and that sort of thing, which as a historian, is sort of interesting that's where these wars were being fought. But no, I think that becomes a really important theme in the narrative of grievances that Abkhaz would sort of continue to mobilize on a sort of every 10-year basis, really from the late 50s through the 80s. I mean today still. But it also gets at an interesting sort of question, the extent to which, and those narratives do change over time, and I suspect that we will get into that in subsequent questions, but the extent to which, from the Abkhaz perspective, these questions are, I guess, related to Soviet Georgian policies. Many of their grievances are explicitly tied to, a policy that Stalin implemented or that Beria implemented, or, Mgaladze or some sort of local official on the Abkhaz level. But over time, of course, they increase the temporal bandwidth of grievances. So it goes from being a problem with local policies, or how, in their view, Georgians were implementing those policies, to a broader sort of discussion about that ropes into both the Russian imperial period as well as the Democratic Republic of Georgia period. So it's a longer kind of narrative of, in their view, right, Georgian attempts to erase or at least water down, Abkhazia and Abkhaz as an entity. And that gets, I think, into more challenging territory then once open conflict does come in the 90s.
Yes, it becomes very challenging territories in 1950s, especially you both mentioned the ethnogenesis narratives that emerged in Georgia and had some follow-up answers from Abkhaz side. And but it's also interesting that despite the fact that during the Koreanization policy, national empowerment of Abkhaz started, and some political level of the national project of Abkhaz was implemented in 1920, 1930, but in the historiography, the independent national Abkhaz project was voiced only in the 1970s. It started in the 1960s by Shaloina Lipa and continued by Zuraban Chabadze and Shaloina Lipa. And in the 1970s, you have the statement by the two influential Abkhaz historians who claim that Abkhazia belong only to Abkhaz ethnic groups, and there's no mentioning about Georgians. And of course, this war of historians, war of anthropologists, war of archaeologists damaged the communication between Georgians and Abkhaz. And my next question is somehow connected to this watershed moment, or the most tricky moment in the history of these nations during the Soviet period. I have found it puzzling that for internally displaced people from Abkhazia, for Georgian IDPs, the war started in a single night. And I belong to these groups. I'm from Sokhumi, and my parents also believe that war started suddenly, because it's a perception of this war. But the early experiences of miscommunication, the early experiences of this war of between academics and conflicts are totally faded away from this collective memory somehow. And when I started working on this Georgian Abkhaz project, my first question was how they believe that people with different imaginings about past, present, and future, and most importantly about each other, they have different, they define each other as not the same, they for example, Abkhaz defined themselves as no Georgians, and Georgians wanted to integrate Abkhaz in their national project, but Abkhaz refused to this proposal, and how this situation was could be omitted from the perception of Georgians. It's very tricky. My next question is about the communication between these groups in the later period, and what was a turning point in the relationship between Georgians and Abkhaz in the late years of Soviet Union? How did these early experiences contribute to the ongoing tensions and shape the conflict scenario? And is there anything we can learn from the Soviet past? The most painful or difficult question for
I start. So I do talk about this. It is kind of beyond the scope, obviously, of this book, which is really about the 20s and 30s. But in the epilogue to the book, I sort of reflect on what I think are the longer-term consequences of Soviet nationality policy, in part which the events in Abkhazia kind of illustrate. So in addition to what I think one of those major consequences is, again, this kind of zero-sum conception of identity and who owns territory, I think another perhaps paradoxical but maybe inevitable consequence of the Soviet nationality policy and its essence of positive discrimination but deciding who gets what based on ethnicity is it reifies ethnic identity. It makes real something that's really pretty abstract to begin with. And again, the Bolsheviks began all of this as what they saw as a concession and a temporary policy to manage nationalism. And they themselves were, it's been said, if you study nationalism, there's the conception of modernism, of Ernest Gellner, for example, that national identity in its, or nationalism in its modern sense as a political platform, a mobilizational political platform, is this is something fairly recent, but also something kind of constructed, that it's not primordial, it doesn't come from God, it doesn't somehow emerge naturally for the evolution of humans, but that it is a social construction. The Bolsheviks were students of Gellner before Gellner was born. And their idea was basically this, from their Marxist perspective, that nationalism and national identity is not crucial, that it is a construction and will disappear in the future. Right? They thought class is more important. But because they decided that they were going to recognize identity and they were going to distribute who gets what or who doesn't get what based on national identity, it becomes really important. So the paradox is, rather than as they expected, nationalism and national identity in the future would disappear, and that we would have zbliženie sliyania and družba narodov, in fact we get the opposite, that people become absolutely convinced of a primordial conception of national identity, that this is something absolutely essential. It's something I think it really kind of continues in this part of the world, that people are convinced that national identity is something that comes from God, that is an essential part of human identity. And this primordial, unchanging conception of national identity by the 1980s becomes one that is, again, very exclusionary. You can be or you're not, and a territory is ours or it's not. And these conceptions of national identity, especially in the more dissident versions of the national movement that really come to the fore as the system begins to fall apart, and have to do with these narratives of ethnogenesis and narratives of Georgia for the Georgians, or that Georgians are you are a Georgian or you're not, and this territory should belong to us. And inevitably, these what begin as academic disagreements about ethnogenesis and autochthony and history of territory and such becomes, as the state begins to collapse, as you are facing a situation of anarchy, those things become real motivations for fear. And this is more perhaps questions for political scientists, of the shadow of the future, the security dilemma, and this sense of if the center in the past was holding all of this together, and that's sort of what mitigated all of these discussions and kept them academic, and it is exactly the Sukhumi-Moscow triangle that we have as the title of the session, right? You always had a structure, and each would make use of that, right? Sukhumi would appeal to Tbilisi or Moscow, and Moscow would try to mitigate things. Every time these discussions about Ingarodka or about these different theories sort of got out of hand, Moscow would come and say, okay guys, calm down, apologize. They'd always be that sort of arbitrator from outside. And when the system begins to fall apart by the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, then you have that threat of that mitigating factor disappears, and all of a sudden now we are going to be in a new entity, in a system where each conception of each national group is exclusive to the other. And then that creates a situation for a potential security dilemma. How that actually develops into armed conflict, I think, is a much more complicated thing, and I think it's very right that things happened that were unexpected. You had additional factors of geopolitics. It's a very complicated and confusing situation where you had the emergence of, first of all, as the Soviet system collapses, you have widespread distribution of weaponry as the Soviet military disappears. You have the geopolitics of different agencies of different governments, different branches of the Russian government competing with one another. You have the emergence of paramilitaries and so forth. And so it does sort of become a surprise in 1992. Many thought that although there had been violence and even casualties in 1989, that was sort of the peak of it. And that if there's going to be conflict, then it's going to be in Ossetia, it's going to be elsewhere. And then it was really quite a surprise in 1992, I think, when it broke out into armed conflict. And then another question I think that political scientists haven't fully dealt with is how you have that moment when the sense of threat and fear becomes such that you have the mass population flight, of how that happens and what the triggers particularly for that are.
So I think to your question of what was the turning point in the relationship between Georgia and Abkhaz in the late Soviet period, I don't know that I have a definitive answer to that question. It's probably up for debate, but I have a few things to maybe consider put on the table. So in my book, I look in detail at moments of demonstration and in some instances violence in Tbilisi and Sukhumi in 1956-57, 77-78, and 89. I think there are similarities and differences across those sort of three moments, but the book does look at them in some depth. And the fact that there is such a symbiotic relationship there between what is, in some instances happening first in Tbilisi and then in Sukhumi, in other instances it's starting in Sukhumi and kind of being answered in Tbilisi, that's not an accident. And so I think that dynamic quality, that symbiosis is crucial to sort of examine over time. And it also is important, particularly in the case of the 50s and the 70s, that we see this sort of outburst not just of public demonstrations against policies from the center, whether that center is Tbilisi or Moscow, depending on where you sit, but they're using kind of official outlets to express these. In the case of 1956, it was not just the demonstrations, but the aftermath. They're using party meetings and things of that sort to try to understand what this policy change means, how to understand the violence against demonstrators and everything, and then in the case of Abkhazia and other minorities in the Republic, what this means for them. In 1978, of course, Abkhaz, Georgians, and others are leveraging the officially sanctioned discussions around the draft of the new constitution in order to kind of open up a wider discussion about language rights, other national rights, the possibility of secession in the case of Abkhazia. And so, these are official mechanisms to express opinion and grievance and that sort of thing. And so that's why kind of we have those openings when we do. But something that really struck me in looking at these three moments in time kind of across a 30-year period was how both Georgians and Abkhaz, in the case of the 50s and the 70s, would in some instances not try to limit their justification for perceived, fear, victimization, that sort of thing, to their own ethnic group. It was strategic, of course, but there was an attempt in some cases for Abkhaz to kind of try to say, hey, this is what Georgians are trying to do in Abkhazia. This affects us and the Greeks and Russians and other groups in the Republic. So it's all non-Georgians kind of being affected by Georgian policies. But we see Georgians adopting kind of a similar tactic in the 50s as well as in the 70s, trying to talk about how an Abkhaz quote unquote nationalist position or chauvinistic position is affecting negatively entitled Georgians, of which were a considerable number in Abkhazia, but also other groups, whether they're Greeks or Armenians or others. So trying to group various different minority populations together against the other. And so I find that to be kind of an interesting counterexample in those earlier decades to the binary of Georgian versus Abkhaz. They were trying to make it, I guess, a more diffuse or larger issue against who they viewed kind of the key, instrument against their interests were. You don't see that as much by the time you get to the late 80s. There, I think the categories are set. The perception of who the greatest danger is much more hardened, I think, and that's why, when we get to the outbreak of outright, war, it has the repercussions that it does. But I think it's also important to underscore, even then, in the mid to late 80s and trickling into the early 90s, that this perception of fear of national endangerment and that sort of thing, goes far beyond just these two groups. I talk about that quite a bit in my final chapter, but it brings up the issue of situational minorityhood that I talked about at the outset. Depending on who you are and where you sit, gives you a very different position on the extent to which you and your national group, might be in danger. But that all gains, so much currency so quickly, by the late 80s.
Yes, it's quite interesting what you mentioned that in 1980s old histories returned back in, but their voice publicly. For example, Gamsahurdia's famous speech about Abkhaz, their North Caucasian tribes came to Georgian lands, and of course this conflicting history also helped to shape this war scenario between these groups, and also this primordial understanding of ethnicity and the battle over lands and over ancestors. But my last question is still neglected, and I will repeat it if I may. So yes, is there anything we can learn from the Soviet experiences? Because we know that Russia still tries to take position of the center and stand between Georgia and Abkhaz negotiation processes. And if you look these meetings when both groups sit on the table, there is someone from Russia representation. So Russia tries to be center between Tbilisi and Sokhum. And in this situation, in this triangle, what can we learn from the past? And so, of course, some people believe that history does not teach us anything, and others argue that yes, there's something we can learn from history. And what's your take on this?
So I'd say at the most basic level, and one of the reasons why I chronicle kind of the Abkhaz, counterexample in my book so frequently, is that much like your personal experience, I think the perception certainly outside of Georgia is that the war in 1992 came out of nowhere, right? Yes. That's obviously not true. There was obviously a very long and consistent genealogy throughout the Soviet period of policies, in Abkhazia as well as in Georgia more broadly that led people to feel pretty genuine grievance, and they expressed it consistently and pretty frequently. At various points in Moscow and Tbilisi, and authorities in Abkhazia tried to intervene and find solutions that would at least get the problem or the situation to calm down. But needless to say, it didn't fix. It was a Band-Aid kind of that got maybe less effective with each application every 10 years. I think that the late 70s example, it does seem there, Shevardnadze and some of the Moscow counterparts who were dispatched to try to develop, a set of policy solutions that would put the genie back in the bottle here. But by then, the call for territorial transfer to the RSFSR had already been made and reiterated, and so that increases stakes for Moscow considerably. If you're asking for place names to be changed and more, cadres from the Abkhaz nationality or improved schooling or a new university, that's one thing. redrawing the borders that late in the game. I think they recognized what a Pandora's box that would be, and so that was just a non-starter at that point. But I think over time that became a demand that was non-negotiable from the Abkhaz side, and so I'm sure Tim has thoughts on that, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, I would add, or maybe just on a more basic level, that one of the threads that runs through the past 200 years, say early modern to modern history of this part of the world, is that the dominant form of organization overall has been empire, be it different forms, and obviously things change a lot between the Tsarist period and the Soviet period, and even within the Soviet period you have different things change. It's not a stasis from one to the other, but it remains an empire in the sense that it is a hierarchy, and an ethnic hierarchy, and one in which you have central authority that tries to make use of different levers that it has to control. And nationality policy in the Soviet period was, as we've been talking about, I think one of those mechanisms to try to control. And obviously depoliticizing nationalism is one of those, but creating territories and so forth. All of these things have their instrumental goals behind them, right? A kind of divide and rule. It is a paradoxical, unexpected outcome, I think, of the Bolsheviks' early decisions that, as I've argued earlier, that it creates a zero-sum conception of territorial identity, and also fundamental conception of people of ethnic identity as being something inflexible and unchanging, and these kind of narratives about territory of who they belong to. Perhaps in the longer, the question of how do we overcome these, what can we learn from the future, I guess? What does the Soviet experience tell us? Well, one is that probably these kinds of attempts to resolve ethnicity don't work. It has the opposite result, that it ensconces ethnic identity. But something more fundamental is that if we want to resolve these conflicts, ultimately we need to get over conceptions of identity which are essentially Soviet creations, albeit unintentional ones. These zero-sum conceptions of territorial ownership, the exclusive categories of national identity, and to think critically about those narratives of the past that come from this Soviet period. And many of these still exist in Abkhaz society and Georgian society. These historical debates are clearly not over. If you go ask anybody on the street, who the Abkhaz are, they will give you basically a variant of the Ingoroku theory, that they came down from the mountains, that their territory does not belong to them, and it should be ours for all these historical arguments. And I think we need...
May I interrupt? Or there is total ignorance about this issue. Yes.
But more likely, I think people are quite educated about these sort of things. I mean, I think if you did a survey of most people on the street, they would know some variant of that argument. And well, the question then becomes, and our colleague Becca Kobakhidze brought this up last year and created a great deal of controversy. But I mean, the question is ultimately, so what? I mean, okay, is it true or is it not? Does it matter? Who came 300 years ago or 500 years ago? Can we get beyond these ethnic conceptions of belonging and identity in order to create some broader understanding of who we are, and one that allows us to not have a zero-sum conception of territorial ownership, but one that will allow us to talk to each other and not to keep bringing up these same historical narratives again and again as a tool to say this is ours, and rather, how can this be ours in the general sense? How can we share it somehow and get beyond these narratives, which are themselves the creation of that empire and of that historical legacy of empire?
Thank you very much. I think we are in the middle somewhere in the adoption of civic concept of nationalism, because on the state level it's declared, but on civil level it does not work entirely. So there are many people who don't tolerate this concept, and this ethnic understanding of territories, ethnic understanding of nations still permeates into the memory of the people. Thank you very much for your precise and accurate analysis on the question, on these topics. And now I would like to ask audience, please, floor is yours if you have questions. Please, Professor Nodia.
Like speaking to mic or... I'm not historian, so I have theoretical question, mostly to Claire, because it's about her title or her wording of this entitled nation. Short formulation would be, is that term only applicable to Soviet nationality policy, or maybe also Yugoslav as kind of an analogy to that, or it may have a kind of broader. Why I'm saying that, because as I agree completely with Tim that for understanding Soviet nationality policy, it is really crucial to understand its fundamental internal contradiction, that there is this ideological fantasy of proletarian internationalism and there's future kind of merger into some common harmonious whatever humanity or Sovietness at least, and all this nationality policy is considered kind of temporary concession or temporary arrangement. But okay, then these temporary arrangements are much stronger than those in the ideological fantasies. So, but what I think it should be added there, that these territorial arrangements are also imitations of Western, basically European models, right? So Soviet Union had some imitationary or appearance of democracy. There were parliamentary democracy, Supreme Soviets, who created governments, and sort of, okay, they had prime ministers, etc. It was just appearance because really Communist Party decided everything, but somehow they needed these appearances for whatever reason. And then in perestroika times, these appearances somehow acquired reality. Very strange. And exactly the same is true of this ethnic federalism, which was also appearance because there was no true division of sovereignty. I mean, Georgia was not sovereign or anything, but certain tasks were delegated maybe, but it was not sovereign. But again, in perestroika time, it became real. And also, Georgia, as Armenia, Azerbaijan also were imitation nation states, but these nation states were not created by Soviet Union, but they were established in 1918, and the pretense was that they were never abolished. They just happened, just government changed somehow it was given to Bolsheviks, and then they voluntarily joined this, whatever it was, right? But then, okay, we are again nation state celebrating our beginning in May 1918, right? And so if that is so, then also this specific kind of status of dominant group or whatever you call it could be also, could it be, or that's a question, that could it be, could we say that Germans in Germany are entitled as a group who will decide, what the status of Turks should be, or maybe if you speak about genuine ethnic federations or asymmetric federations, whatever you call it, are Scots in Scotland entitled nation, or Catalonians in Catalonia, can we say that it's entitled, or it's just uniquely Soviet?
Thank you for the question, and it's a good one. So I think I don't know that I have a firm answer as to, yes, it's solely Soviet, or, oh, it has all these broader applicabilities. My sense is that, well, I of course came up with it to explicitly explain the sort of peculiarity of Soviet empire. I think the debate about was the Soviet Union an empire is sort of over, like it was. I feel pretty strongly about that. It was a hierarchy for managing difference, despite the fact that Stalin and Lenin adamantly, thought it was anti-imperial at its core. That's not, what it was in practice. Yeah, an anti-imperial empire, I think is what I call it in the book. So I think, definitely seek to explain the Soviet ethno-territorial kind of federal structure, and the extent to which it was, viewed as fictive or could be, tested and acted upon over the course of the Soviet experience. So not limited to Georgia, certainly. not limited to the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia, that would be an interesting test case. The one that I've tried to start thinking about just as a thought experiment that I don't have answers for, but I would actually be very curious to see the extent to which this concept could be applied to sort of early communist China. Given that they did adopt, so many of the kind of the Soviet blueprint toward managing ethno-national diversity, but of course it had a very different trajectory from there. But that borrowing, especially during Stalin's lifetime, and what that looks like with the de-Stalinization, the Sino-Soviet split, etc. Like that's something that I would like to explore more, but I'm in the very earliest stages of trying to look at that. So I hope that others, if they come across this and read my book, try to test that a little bit. But I think certainly in the broader socialist world, there might be a there. The other, I know, curious sort of ethno-federal arrangement that might be worth looking at too is Ethiopia. Again, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert there, but I think that that's another possible test that could be interesting for the extent to which this is applicable or not, kind of beyond the Soviet Union. Questions of civic nationalism, of other sort of ethno-federal arrangements, etc. Maybe not, but I think the Soviet blueprint is an important one in this instance. I think I captured everything. That was a long question.
Can I add just one thing, and that's something that Gia's question brought to my mind that perhaps we have not given significant attention to in our discussion today, which is the Gorbachev factor and perestroika. And Gorbachev, for very specific political reasons, as he's attempting to reform the system, finding that he has no power, tries increasingly radical things. And in 1986, after the failure of his initial reform attempts, takes a very specific decision that the thing that will help me, that will put pressure on the bureaucracy, is if I let people complain. Give people the new Soviet human right of complaining, so that it begins the policy of glasnost, of openness. And he's expecting that people are going to complain about the same things he does, about bureaucracy and red tape and all of that, which is to a degree true, but of course the thing that he underestimates, that he completely doesn't understand, probably coming from the imperial center, is in the periphery, what people want to talk about is exactly those narratives which have been bubbling below the surface about territory, about ownership, about ethnogenesis. And so that creates the opportunity for all of that to come blowing up into the surface. And then by the end, by 88, 89, he's increasingly becoming radical, trying to increase his own power. And part of that is to increase his own legitimacy. And that's where he takes very specific decisions, that he wants to empower government institutions over party ones, to remove the block of the party, and then to make the fictional constitutional arrangement real by empowering governments at the center level and then also at the Union Republic level. And so that is a really important contribution. It's resulting from specific political decisions that, as Gia said, makes this fiction into a kind of reality that creates what were just state structures on paper into ones that are real or potentially real.
And ones that are very self-conscious of what the others are doing. Knowledge in Georgia of, we don't want Karabakh to happen here. What is happening in Central Asia? What's happening in the Baltics? None of these national conversations are happening in isolation. They're very much, I think, both preempting and responding to each other in real time. And, in many cases, the inaction of the center then just further kind of facilitates that dynamic quality.
Thank you. Is there any questions? Please.
Thank you for your presentation of the book and the theme too. This is the problem you discussed in your books, very crucial for the present time. And I think that it is not connected only with the communists, Bolsheviks, or who we call now Abkhazs. It is connected to other groups too. Well, first of all, if we speak about clientelism, what we call Abkhazians, the clients of Kremlin, or Kremlin and Bolsheviks had, quite many other clienteles as well. In Tbilisi, among Georgians, among other groups maybe, and I think that it was so. Not only Lakoba was the client of Bolsheviks. Then I think that if you are historians and you study this question from the point of historical science, others can study and look over it from other positions. And one of these positions is the language. I don't want to say that from the linguistic point of view, but from the language point of view. As for Abkhazia and Abkhazians, the name Abkhazians was dedicated to all groups of peoples who lived there. But if historically they were, they say Megrelians, but I think that they were Abkhazians too, at least from the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and 10th century they were Abkhazians. They were Swans and many other smaller groups. But it wasn't until 1920s or 1980s maybe, or after 1922, when the name was fixed for a certain ethnic group, and this ethnic group were Apsuas. As for Lakoba, it is known that he didn't quite agree with calling Apsuas, to give Apsuas the name of Abkhaz. This is one position, because he knew that they were Apsuas, not Abkhazians. And the second point is that he didn't believe that Abkhazia could be separated from Georgia. But it happened after 50 years ago or something like that. I want to go back to the position of the linguistic position, let's say it. We use languages to spread our ideas, but the languages give the picture of the world. And the picture of the world differs from Abkhazians. Well, I don't mean Apsua. It is different for Georgians, and it is different for Russians. When Russians gave the name, So we can use the names of the pictures of the world of different peoples. I think that the Russian picture of the world was spread in Europe, in other parts of the world, and it is dominating even today what we are speaking and how we are speaking about situations in local places. Well, what do you think about this?
Thank you. It was a question or it was a comment?
It was a comment. It was a comment, but I think that it is necessary to look at the question from different sides, and only historical science gives a partial view, I think, as well as other sides will give a partial view of the problem as well. ბადრი ქუთელია.
Thank you for your comment. Of course, there are many perceptions among Georgians and Abkhaz, and just to clarify, Absua is a name that Abkhaz calls themselves. It's their ethnonym.
No.
If there are any,
Absuas called
you want to
themselves
elaborate
Absua.
on.
Russians called them Abkhaz, and then Soviet Georgians also called them Abkhaz. And then they created a national state of Abkhaz, and dominant part of this state were Absua language and Absuas.
There are many versions of history, many theories, and thank you for voicing your theory. Thank you very much. And is there any question or comments? Კი ბატონო. კი ბატონო. მიკროფონი. კი. სინქრონული თარგმანია. აი ეს.
აი რაც შეეხება აფსვა და აფხაზს, მე ვარ სოხუმიდან. დევნილია. ომამდე თქვენ ჩემთან შედარებით ბავშვი ხართ, მე უბრალოდ ასაკოვანი ადამიანი ვარ და მახსოვს, რომ ისეთი გამდე ესე? ხო, კარგი. უკაცრავად. მე ვმუშაობდი შერეულ კოლექტივში, სადაც აფხაზები ჭარბობდნენ და დირექტორი იყო აფსუა შლარბა. ქართველები ძალიან ცოტა, ერთი ბერძენი და ერთი რუსი. და ყოველთვის ეს არის 80-იანი წლების დასასრული და ომის წინა წლები. გაძაბული სიტუაცია იყო. გვიახლოვდებოდა ომი, მათ ყველა მიცოდნენ რომ ომი იყო, სხვათა შორის ბოლო წლებში გამოქვეყნდა შამბას ვიდეო, სადაც ის ამბობს, რომ ჩვენ ვემზადებოდით ომისთვის, ჩვენ ვიკრიბებოდით აფხაზეთის სხვადასხვა წერტილებში, ტყეებში, იქ გეგმავდით, როგორ მოქცეულიყავით იარაღი საიდან გვეშოვა. ეს იმასთან დაკავშირებით, რომ ქართველებმა დაიწყეს და ქართველები არიან ესე პროვოცირება გაუკეთეს ქართველებმა. და იქ კამათებში ესეთი რაღაცა იყო. Как вы не понимаете, грузины, что мы абсу, а не абхазы. არაერთხელ უთქვამთ. იყო მაგალითად ომამდე აფსვა ჟლარ, აფხაზი ხალხი, აფსნი ალაშარა. ეს გაზეთი გამოდიოდა როგორც აფხაზეთის საბჭოთა აფხაზეთი. იყო კიდევ აფსვა ჟლარ და აფსნი страна души. აფსნი. ომის შემდეგ გავიდა 2 თუ 3 წელი და ბილბორდებზე წერია აფხაზია страна души. აფსნის საერთოდ ამოვიდა ლექსიკიდან აფხაზი ქართველების განდევნის შემდეგ, მაგრამ ეს იყო დიდი რუსი ძმის ალბათ კარნახი, რომ თქვენ ხართ აფხაზები, იმიტომ რომ მხარეს ქვია აფხაზეთი. და დღესაც სულ წერია აფხაზია. აფსნი არის მხოლოდ აფხაზურ ენაზე. როცა ინფორმაციას გადაცემენ ან ტელეგადაცემები მიდის. ასე რომ ქართველების დადანაშაულება ზედმეტ ნაციონალიზმში ეს მე მგონი კი არა ვიცი. ყველაფერს ჩვენ გვაბარალიან და რა არის ნაციონალიზმი? ჩუდია, კარგია, ექსტრემიზმია. ჩვენ ხომ მოვიწყეს 80-წლიდან და გენოციდი. მაგრამ მაგ დღევანდელი კონფლიქტოლოგები ამბობენ არა, ჩვენ ქართველებისთვის არ მოუწვიათ. და სხვათა შორის თბილისელები სულ სხვანაირად აზროვნებენ ვიდრე ადგილობრივები აფხაზეთიდან, იმიტომ რომ ეს ხალხი გამოიარა ომი, განიცადა ესეთი ემოციური წნეხი და სხვანაირად ვერ იფიქრებენ. დღევანდელ დღემდე ესე გვიყურებენ ჩვენ. მაგრამ ჩვენ ვართ ქართველები. სხვათა შორის ბატონმა აკაკი ბაქრაძემ პირველად შემოიტანა ცნება, თქვენ ხომ აფხაზეთში ცხოვრობთ და თქვენ ხართ აფხაზები, ისევე როგორც ჯავახები, ქართველები, ვინც ჯავახეთში ცხოვრობს, ისევე როგორც იმერლები, ხო, მაგრამ ქართველები არიან. მაგრამ მაშინ ჩვენ ეს არ გვესმოდა. მაშინ სხვანაირი მაშინ საბჭოთა კავშირში ცხოვრობდით და ბევრი რაღაცა შეიცვალა ხო ცნობიერებაში. და დღესაც რომ სულ ქართველების დადანაშაულება არის აფხაზეთში, გინდა ოსეთში, ეს არის რაღაც საშინელება, როდესაც ჩვენ მოგვიწყეს ეს ყველაფერი. როდესაც ქართველებს არა ერთი წუთი და დავასრულებ. ქართველებს არ გველაპარაკებოდნენ, რამდენჯერ შევსულა რაღაც უნივერმაღში, ბოდიში ვხდი, ნერვიულობ დღემდე. და მიკითხია, ხო, იცოდნენ რომ რახან ქართველი ვარ, აქცენტით რუსულად რომ ვლაპარაკობ, ქართული აქცენტი ვარ. პასუხს არ მაძლევდნენ. და მარტო მე კი არა. Вот вы, грузины, идиоты, ремонтируете дома, покупаете квартиры. Зачем вам это надо? Это все нам останется. ეს ზღაპრები არ არის. ეს რეალურად იყო ასე. მე პირადად არ მჯეროდა. მე არ ვიცოდი მაშინ, მე სტუდენტი ვიყავი და ვერ წვდებოდი. აზრს ვერ წვდებოდი. როგორ შეიძლება რომ რაღაცა ამდაგვარი მოხდეს და მე გამაგდონ სახლიდან, ჩემი სახლიდან რატო? არ არის საჭირო ზედმეტი ლოიალობა და ზედმეტი ტოლერანტობა, რაც ქართველებს ახასიათებს. ნამდვილად არ არის და ჩემს კუთვნილ ბოდიშს სხვა ნუიხტის. მადლობთ.
მადლობა კომენტარისთვის და ქართულად უპასუხებ და რადგან შესაძლებლობა გვაქვს თარგმანის.
ეს მიგაჩნიათ ერთი რაღაცა. რამდენიმე გამსახურდია რო თქვა, რომ ჩამოსახლებულები არიანო. ეს მე არ ვიცი, ზოგიერთი ამბობს რომ არა, ეს ასე არ უთქვამს. თვითონ თბილისელებიც მე სამწუხაროდ მე არ მომისმენია მაგრამ
კადრები არსებობს და ის
კარგი თქვენ მიგაჩნიათ რომ ამან ომი გამოიწვია როდესაც მთელი 50-50-იანი წლებიდან სულ იყო ყოველი 5-10 წელი აფხაზების
აი ამაზე საუბრობდით ზუსტად აი კარგი იქნებოდა რომ მოგესმიათ მთელი ეს შეხვედრა იყო ამაზე საუბარი რომ ეს ომი არ დაწყებულა ერთ დღეში რამდენიმე გამარტება ამ სურს გავაკეთო პირველი ქართველებს არავინ არ დანაშაულებს ომის დაწყებაში აქ ამ შეხვედრაზე პირიქით ჩვენ ვჯელობთ ხო უბრალოდ რადგან ვერ მოისმენთ ინგლისურად ეს რომ ესეთი ადეკვატური შთაბეჭდილება დაგჭერთ ამ დღევანდელ შეხვედრაზე ამ შეხვედრის მიზანი არ არის ესე იგი ქართველებს დანაშაულება აფხაზებს დანაშაულება ამ კონფლიქტში ამ შეხვედრის მიზანი იყო ანალიტიკურად გაგვიაზრებინა რა მოხდა საბჭოთა წარსულში, რატომ მოხდა, საიდან დაიწყო ეს ყველაფერი, აი ამ თემებზე მსჯელობდით. რასაკვირველია ყველას გააჩნია საკუთარი აზრი და მადლობა ავტობიოგრაფიული მეხსიერების მოშველებისთვის, იმიტომ რომ ეს ავსებს ხოლმე ზოგადად კოლექტიურ მეხსიერებას ცალკეული მომენტებით, ეხლა თქვენ გაქვთ პირადი მომენტები წარსულიდან, რაც შეიძლება ჩვენ არ ვიცოდეთ. მე პატარა ვიყავი მით უმეტეს იმ პერიოდში და ბევრი რამე არ ვიცი. უბრალოდ აი სწორი შთაბეჭდილება დაგჭერთ დღევანდელი შეხვედრიდან ეს არის წარსულის გაზიარება ისტორიული პერსპექტივიდან და მსჯელობა მოვლენების შეფასება ანალიტიკური პერსპექტივიდან, თეორიული პერსპექტივიდან. თუ რამე კითხვა გაქვს შეგვიძლია შეხვედრის მერე გავიცნოთ და ვისაუბროთ. მადლობა.
შეიძლება ციტატა სუისი ჩემი არა.
ძალიან სამწუხარო აქ იყო მოსასმენები და ძალიან გული ხდება რომ აი გავიწიდო და ხდება უბრალოდ
So the quote გამსახურდია I've never heard that he was against Abkhaz because those who live in Abkhazia, they were all Abkhazians. But this does not mean that all Abkhazians should be Abkhaz too. So now the quote. There's a book of Theodor von Tornau. He was a Russian spy officer during the Russia war in the northern Caucasus. And when Russia won this war, then Theodor Tornau wrote about that they have destroyed those who didn't agree with them. They transferred to Turkey those were also didn't agree with them, and those who agreed with them, and they were sent to internal parts of Russia. And he writes, now our mission or our aim is to follow those people above the mountain range, clear the territory from the population and prepare it for colonization. That's about, maybe I'm not sure, but about before 1860s, these words. It is published in Russian, and if you are interested, you can find it. So, well, it wasn't Georgians that say that they came from the north. Simply obscure places there in the northern Caucasus. And if they live today, now about more than 100 years there, yes, okay, why shouldn't live there? They can live there absolutely as any other man of any other nationality can live there. Besides this, there were absolutely closest ties between Abkhazians and Georgian Abkhazians there. Thank you, and excuse me, please.
Thank you, Madloba. Just to clarify, there are many versions of history, and if you look, Georgians and Abkhaz represent the past from different viewpoints, and they have their own versions. And we are just talking about these versions of history, about divergence of perception. And it's difficult. We can imagine the past because past is not real, and we cannot see it, and we cannot witness. We just rely on the sources, and we can interpret it.
But can I mean more specifically?
Yes.
We've been having these arguments for decades, and you're right. Those questions go back to the 19th century. David Bakradze wrote something in 1889 about this Apsua, and they're from the mountains. They should go back. So what? So effing what? Does this matter? Should we continue? Is it helpful to continue this discussion? Does it gain us anything? Does it matter who calls themselves this, that?
No.
Who came here 50 years ago? Who came here 300 years ago? Who came here 2,000 years ago? Who is autochthonous? Does that solve anything? Does that help us?
The Russian language took the name Abkhaz from Abkhazians and
so
gave it
what?
to a very part.
Ну и что?
So,
What does it matter? What does it matter? Is this worth discussing? Does this get us anywhere?
the question is that they live there and we live there. The question is that they are privileged and they, well, destroyed many Georgians there with the help of Russia. Is not that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But
So
is it the point? Is it useful to continuously go back to the question, Kto vinovaj? Who is guilty? Who should be punished? Who ultimately... Does that help us to overcome that
Russia not finished yet.
Yeah, but I mean, another reason I think discussions like the ones we had today, and I hope the books that we write, is to acknowledge that there is clearly the legacy of empire in these questions, and that those have results from the past that were attempts to control from the center. And we've talked about that.
Yes.
Can I finish, please? That these have very real consequences. But if the question is, how do we move on from that past? How do we overcome the conflicts of the past? What I think is happening is that we are constantly reliving these narratives and discourses which are themselves the creation of that empire, that have been used to control, that have been used to divide. And we keep returning back to them. And I don't think ultimately in the long term that's helpful. We need to overcome that history. We need to understand our own complicity. We need to understand what has been done. We need to understand and deal with commemoration and retribution or assigning of responsibility and so forth, and then move past that, because we're already generations past. We now have 3 generations as a consequence of these conflicts who never have even been there, right? Who have grown up outside of that on both sides of this, who don't talk to each other. And how is it helpful to keep going back to these questions about who the Abkhaz, who the Apsua, what they're called, who is responsible for this? And another factor, maybe just to end this, that I think there is clearly again, empire is important here, and what happens in the world, the role of Russia is important here. But I think there is a tendency here, on the Georgian side, to say, it's only Russia. Russia is to blame. That's it. They came and they did this to us. The Abkhaz are our brothers. They simply don't understand. They simply don't understand that they're not really Abkhazians, that they're Apsua and come from the mountains and should probably go back there.
I'm not against Apsuas.
Right. But there is often the subtone, the undertone of this is that this only happened because the Russians provoked it. This only happened because the Russians came in and did it. And absolutely the Russians made use of this. Absolutely there was divide and rule. On the other hand, in the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union is collapsing, there is a situation of anarchy. So it's not such a black and white situation of how this conflict comes about, how it happens. There are many aspects of creating this situation of distrust, of tension, that again result from this imperial past and are the consequences of that imperial past. But I think it's not so much helpful, one, to continue those narratives and to fixate on those narratives and not to get over them, and two, only to blame somebody on the outside, even if they play a key role, right? Even if it is a very important factor to this. If we're going to get over that, somehow we need to get past it, I think.
Well, and to add one more sentence, the more that the kind of Soviet narratives continue to be dominant, the more of an opening it gives for Russia to continue to operationalize and instrumentalize that. So I think it's in everyone's interest to try to move ahead.
Yes, history leaves its legacy to today's world. That's right. And you don't have to do anything about this legacy. Yes, we can accept it, but there is very great but. Do you think that that kind of clientelism is not practiced from Russia in today's Georgia? Do you think so? Well, I think that today in Georgia, some ethnocentric groups repeat the phraseology of Abkhaz that studied these terminology or phraseology from Russians. And Russians worked hard to give this phraseology that Georgians are the people who they must hate, and so on and so on. The Georgians are the conquerors, and Georgians are the genocide authors of Apsua people, and this phraseology is being repeated in today's Georgia, maybe by other ethnocentric group. It is very weak, but it happens already. Well, that's the legacy, and I think that we have to stand against this tendency or against this trend. That's it. It is a legacy, but it's our today too.
Somebody said, the past isn't over. It's not even past.
Yes, sure. Well, sometimes we repeat the meanings that are put in words, and what Russia gave its name, or Russian language gave its name to the world. We repeat this in Georgia, Georgians, and in all the world, because they know other words through Russian. Excuse me again.
Thank you very much. We can end today's discussion, and I have short notes. Thank you for coming on this momentous day, because today we commemorate 61 years since the fall of Sokhumi, and it's a very painful chapter in our history. And thank you for joining us and taking part in our discussion. Thank you for listening, for sharing your thoughts or not sharing. but maybe reflecting proudly about the topic discussed here. So we can end here.